Hi, everybody. Uh, just wanted to go over what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to continue talking about intake assessments, okay? And we're going to sort of pick up where we were last time, but I want to give you an example and walk through a very comprehensive form of intake assessment. So Correctional Service of Canada is a very comprehensive form of intake assessment. So that's anybody, as you should know, but by now I would assume, anybody sentenced to sentence or prison sentences of 2 years or more by a judge would then be under the jurisdiction of Correctional Service of Canada. All right. So just briefly going over again the role of assessment instruments inventories. Okay. So many agencies with specialized services use a variety of instruments to identify clients' uh, and more clearly define the intervention that's necessary. So these assessment instruments really define what sort of programs, what interventions, anything that a person is going to be required to do or may need to do while they're in prison, in this case, but also within any other organization. Depending on their mandate, the resources available, they'll use some sort of assessment instrument or some sort of inventory to identify what the client's needs and how they can effectively intervene to assist the client with those needs, and uh, to monitor their services appropriately. So we went through the substance abuse, the ASI Light. There's other substance abuse assessment instruments. The ASI Light being one of the more common ones. So that's why we went through that one. There's the VRAG, the Disposable Assault Risk Assessment Guide. All right. There's the Adult Community Risk Needs Assessment and the Static 99. And Static 99 looks at a number of static features to see what a person's risk based on those static features are in future reoffending. All right, so Correctional Service of Canada, CSC, and all the PowerPoints here, it's going to be called CSC. All right. So they do a very comprehensive intake assessment. A person gets sentenced by a judge. Quite often they've done time in remand before that sentencing decision. So they've done time provincially, but have never really had as comprehensive an intake assessment as they will get once they're sentenced to 2 years or more. So they would go to a place called the Regional Reception and Assessment Center, otherwise known as RRAC, RRAC, and that's in Abbotsford. All right. And during RRAC, they're usually there for anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, 6 weeks being the norm. On the lower end, if it's somebody who's had a previous federal admission, then they can sometimes bypass some of the assessments and some of the assessment that goes on there. But that time, okay, we're talking a month to 2 months, that time is spent doing assessments, trying to assess the person's risks, trying to assess the person's needs, trying to see what sort of services, how best to use the services and the interventions available to mitigate risk to the public upon a person's discharge from jail, either through parole, statutory release, or warrant expiry date in the future, right? So even somebody who's a life or a life 25, the bulk of their assessment is going to be done during this time. And then their whole correctional plan, all the programs that they're required to take, all the penitentiary placements, a lot of that information is assessed during this very initial stage. So it's very important to have this done properly, because everything that's done throughout a person's sentence afterwards is built on this information. So it uses a risk needs model. So what is the risk to the community? What risk does this person pose? And what needs does this person have? How can we utilize interventions that are available within the prison system to try to change some of the dynamic features or dynamic risk factors for the person, which we'll talk about static and dynamic risk factors again here as well. So it's completed to determine risk. So to person's risks to themselves, so self-harm like suicide, self-destructive behaviors. Risk to other inmates, so if there's incompatibles, if the person's known to have a long history of inmate on inmate assaults, risk to staff, risk to the community, risk to their own family, right? So even if a person's at risk of domestic violence, well, that's not going to be a factor necessarily in jail, but they're going to look at that for future private family visits, all that. And that's, again, all done right at the intake stages, very early on in a person's prison sentence, okay? They also look at, obviously, escape risk, because that means that person has to have a more secure facility than, say, a William Head institution or a minimum security institution that quite often, or most often, are not fenced. So looking at these risk factors while incarcerated, and the person's risk to reoffend once they're released. This is all determined in this initial RAC phase, okay, at the intake assessment. So it's also completed to determine the needs. So what are the interventions that are needed here to reduce the criminogenic factors? And by criminogenic factors, we talked about a range of them in class when we first got our client profiles. So looking at those dynamic factors, areas that we can target and build programs around to change the dynamic factors of a person's risk. Okay, again, dynamic factors are seen as things that are changeable, that you can change a person's IQ score while they're in jail, right? You can change a person's ability to control their anger. Those things you can change through interventions. You can't change things like past history of escapes, past criminal offenses. That sort of stuff you can't change. So those would be static factors. The things that can change are seen as dynamic factors, all right? So even somebody who's young, say in that 18 to 25 age range, that's a static factor. You know, we can say, okay, well, the person's getting older, so that static factor might reduce in its effect on a person's overall thing, but we can't introduce a program that's going to help a person age more, right? Age is a static factor. It goes up one day at a time, whether the person's in program or not, all right? So these static factors include having your criminal history, right? Again, you can't go back in time and change that criminal history. It's there, it's done. What do we do from here? You can't change the severity of the offense, right? So measures the nature and degree to which an offender has inflicted harm on society in general and on their victims in particular. So violent offending versus non-violent offending, property offenses, would be a static factor here. If a person's had a history of violence, they're going to score higher, obviously, for their risk than somebody who has not committed violence in their past. Sex offense history. So this measures the nature and extent of sex offending, the amount of harm inflicted on victims, and involvement in assessment, treatment, or intervention in relation to the sex offending. So have they been compliant with treatment before, right? And again, it sounds like a dynamic factor because it's an intervention, right? But it's talking about previous interventions. Were they successfully completed? Were they not successfully completed? Those are static because it happened in the past. Again, we can't change the past. We have to be looking to the future and the things that you can change here and now. So non-compliance with sex offense programming in the past would be seen as actually a static score, not a dynamic score, right? So that would be measured, all of those things in the sex offense history are all measured by the static 99, which only measures static variables. It does not measure any or even consider any dynamic variables. It's a person's risk in the future based on their past reoffending, based on stats. They've done many statistics on people, what their static factors were, and whether they committed another sex offense in the future or not. If they have, they fit this sort of profile, and if you fit more in that profile, then your risk goes up. If you don't fit that profile, your risk goes down. Those sorts of things. All right, so statistical information on recidivism scale. Okay, so they look at things like current offense. What was your current offense? When did it happen? What age was the person when it happened? Obviously, somebody who committed an offense at 18 would be seen as a higher risk because they have no real baseline before that than somebody who didn't commit their first offense until they were 66, right? Look at previous incarcerations. The more previous incarcerations, again, the highest predictor of violent reoffending is past violent reoffending. Okay, that is your strongest predictor across the board, right? Escape history, age at first adult conviction, previous convictions for assault actually apply to all future reoffending. It's strongly correlated there. Marital status at most recent admission. Again, that makes a difference in a person's future reoffending or not, whether they've had community support. It's shown that people that were married when they committed their offense or when they were admitted to the federal system are less likely to reoffend upon release than people who are single, don't have, and basically it comes down to, I would think, although it hasn't been studied in great deal, but people just have more connections to the community, right? Employment status at arrest. Again, a person who was employed and shows that they were employable at the time of their arrest is less likely to reoffend in future than somebody who is unemployed. The interval at risk since last offense. Okay, so if they've had more than one offense, was there an interval with that, or did it happen very quickly after? Total aggregate sentence, right? The longer a person's sentence, the more likely they are to, in the future, engage in those behaviors. More interventions needed to change those behaviors than somebody who is caught in a more minor way, right? So somebody with a very serious sexual offense, say a violent, sadistic rape, would be seen as much more risk of future violent reoffending than somebody who was a voyeur and exposed themselves in public, something like that, right? And then, of course, previous convictions for sex offenses is a huge factor there. So categories of risk. So the categories of risks that are done are high, medium, and low. Okay, so we're going to look at risk first, and then we're going to break down categories of need. Okay, so high risk usually means a high number of previous convictions, high number of previous federal sentences or adult sentences, incarcerations, as opposed to probation, use of weapons in those offenses, frequent or severe use of violence, a record of escapes, failure to comply with either probation, parole, or with prison rules on previous admissions. And the earlier the onset to criminality as an adult, the more likely or the higher risk the person's seen as being, because those behaviors are more seen as being more ingrained, right? If you've had periods as an adult in the community without committing offenses, then that's seen as more of a mitigating factor in risk, where people who don't have those breaks in their criminality and it started very early on in their lives or earlier on in their adulthood, are seen as more of an ongoing risk. Medium risk, 2 or less previous convictions, and that's previous convictions as an adult across the board, doesn't necessarily mean federal convictions. Court sentences, incarcerations, failure to comply, escapes. Again, looking at all these same factors, but just having fewer of them, it sort of puts them in the medium. And medium's hard to define. It's done on a scoring sheet. The scoring sheet's a little too cumbersome to explain in this process, and it doesn't really matter. It doesn't help us understand it that much more, right? These are the things they're looking at intake. So low risk, oftentimes it's the first offense, or they've had a very limited number of offenses, or I had one guy who had an offense, offense in 1985, next offense in 1999, right? There's a huge break in the offending history there. The offenses weren't related. He was seen as quite a low risk. So no weapon use, no violence, primarily property offenders. All right. So I'm going to end this shot here because I'm allowed 15 minutes per screencast-o-matic rules, and I will continue on with the PowerPoint on the next one. All right.